Hello, I'm taking on a challenge to beat every playable Nintendo published game. Welcome to the next episode. The next game is Stack Up. This one is the first of two games that were designed to be used alongside Nintendo's latest invention, the Robot Operating Buddy, or R.O.B for short. Designed by Gunpei Yokoi himself, this device used optical sensors similar to the NES Zapper to make R.O.B react to in-game events. However, before going into too much detail on this strange new device, I think it's finally time we look at the launch of the NES in the West, as it is impossible to talk about the impact R.O.B had without understanding the struggles Nintendo of America had launching the system. So, let's rewind time back to the 1970s, before the Famicom had even released in Japan. In fact, at first, I'm not even going to talk about Nintendo at all. Instead, let's take a look at another giant in the world of video games, Atari. Atari's initial claim to fame was through their arcade sensation, Pong, and they even participated in the first generation of home consoles with a port of this title called Home Pong. However, it wasn't until the second generation that Atari would start to dominate the market. In 1977, they released the Atari Video Computer System, which would later be renamed to the Atari 2600. The console was a huge hit, and it popularized the usage of swappable ROM cartridges to sell games separately from the console. Although the success of the console brought competitors along with it, by 1982, the Atari VCS was the dominant gaming system in North America. I think it's safe to say that we can largely thank Atari for the initial rise of home consoles, at least in the US. However, the console's explosive success did not come without its problems. Due to its popularity, the console ushered in waves of games trying to cash in on the fad, many of which were of questionable quality. Atari themselves weren't even immune to this either, as they too released some titles that were not received well by the public. One notably infamous title they released was E.T., a game with a ton of marketing hype that performed terribly. The game was received so poorly by the public that it far undersold expectations, leading many of the cartridges to be dumped into a landfill in New Mexico, alongside other unsold Atari carts. Failures like this, along with the high amount of unregulated shovelware on the system, shattered the consumers' trust in the industry, leading to a large-scale recession in the video game industry in the US. It got so bad that many people thought video games were just a passing fad that would not last, and many retailers didn't even want to stock game consoles in fear that they wouldn't sell. This event would later come to be known as the video game crash of 1983, and it was going to take something big to recover from it. Despite this disaster in the West, Japan was largely unaffected by the crash, and Nintendo still saw a lot of success with the Famicom in Japan during this time. Just before the crash hit, Nintendo was actually trying to get the Famicom over to the US too. Nintendo knew that the Western market would be skeptical of a new console manufacturer from Japan, so they initially approached Atari to have them release the Famicom in the West under their name. However, just before this deal went through, Atari refused to sign the contract last minute. They incorrectly thought Nintendo had broken a previous contract with them, which stated that Atari had exclusive rights to Donkey Kong on home computers. They thought Nintendo was working with Coleco, one of their biggest competitors, on a PC port of Donkey Kong behind their backs. In reality, Coleco's new PC system was backwards compatible with their home console, the ColecoVision, so the Donkey Kong port they were showing off wasn't anything new. While the misunderstanding eventually got cleared up, it was too late. The crash began to hit Atari hard, and after the departure of their CEO, the deal was never completed, and the Atari-Nintendo collaboration console never ended up existing. This event, combined with the overall state of the market in the West, caused Nintendo to back off from releasing their console in the US, at least initially. Instead, Nintendo leveraged the arcade market to bring their Famicom overseas. We've already talked about it quite a bit, but it was during this time that Nintendo used the Nintendo Versus system to bring their games to the US, and they found quite a bit of success with some of their popular titles. This success gave Nintendo the courage they needed to try once again to bring their console overseas, despite the state the gaming industry was in. Rather than approaching a big name like Atari, this time, Nintendo made the choice to proceed on their own, and they decided the console would need a redesign to stand a chance. Their first attempt was to design it similar to a home computer, which was starting to do well in the West. The console was designed with a full keyboard, and it would come with a cassette data recorder and cartridge that would let people program in a language known as BASIC. These peripherals, alongside the zapper, a joystick, and some controllers, were intended to make the system appear as more than just a video game console. They even redesigned the color scheme to make it appear more futuristic and high-tech. They named this redesign the Advanced Video System, and they showed off the prototype at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in 1985. While the system did garner a lot of attention, the press was extremely skeptical that the system stood a chance. People were convinced that personal computers were the future, and that machines that only focused on playing games were a thing of the past. After receiving this harsh reception, Nintendo decided that they needed to take a different approach. Instead of trying to market it as halfway between a video game console and a home computer, they decided to try and market it as an electronic toy. It was at this time that Nintendo turned to their recent R.O.B invention as a key part of their marketing strategy. They stripped out the cassette recorder and the keyboard and instead put more emphasis on the zapper and R.O.B himself. They still kept the futuristic design from the previous prototype though, but in an effort to obscure the fact that the product was ultimately still a video game console, they called it an entertainment system instead of a video system. Thus, the Nintendo Entertainment System was born. These tactics Nintendo used to avoid the negative connotations associated with video games have led many people today to call R.O.B Nintendo's Trojan horse, as it was used to obscure their console under the guise of a high-tech robot toy. Despite these efforts, getting the console onto store shelves was still difficult. Nintendo of America failed to convince any big companies to distribute their system, which forced them to work with stores directly and deliver their systems themselves. Nintendo would be the ones to supply the stores, do all the marketing, and they even promised to buy back any consoles they didn't manage to sell. This made the deal largely risk-free for the retailers. During this time, everyone at Nintendo of America was all hands on deck. Even Arakawa himself, the head of Nintendo of America, was personally part of the team and was once seen running a TV up a flight of stairs to contribute. Allegedly, they faced a lot of mockery during this time, as some retail staff were pretty open about the dissatisfaction they had with having to sell their consoles, with some people even telling the Nintendo staff that they hoped the console would fail. In October of 1985, the system had officially launched in the West alongside R.O.B, but it did not launch with any sort of large fanfare. It released in only a small handful of locations in New York to a very skeptical market. While the sales were slow at first, apparently they started to pick up steam during the holiday season. This prompted Nintendo to release the console in more test markets such as Los Angeles, Chicago, and San Francisco, and finally the console saw a nationwide release in September of 1986. The early success of the console was thanks in part to R.O.B himself. Not only did it play a role in getting Nintendo to put the system on store shelves, according to an independent research firm in January of 1986, the most popular reason for getting the console was because children wanted the cool-looking robot. Nintendo themselves even realized how big of a role R.O.B had played, as they made bold ads that essentially claimed R.O.B had saved the video game industry after their console's early success. Of course, there were other driving factors too, especially as the console's reach expanded to more markets. Due to how long the console was already out in Japan, the system had an impressive launch lineup, and one game in particular would quickly steal the show from R.O.B. However, we'll look more at that title in a few weeks. Another key component of Nintendo's strategy with the NES in the West was their attempts to ensure that the system would have games of higher quality than their predecessors. One of the ways they did this was through the official Nintendo Seal of Quality. While I've seen some people see it strictly as a seal that said, "Nintendo ensures the game is a good game," it was also made in part to combat bootleg cartridges. The seal meant that the game had gone through the official process of becoming an approved game on the system, so consumers could trust that the game would work as intended. Another component of the NES that was used to fight against bootleg games was the inclusion of a lockout system that was called NES 10. This system included a chip that would be installed onto all official NES cartridges, and the NES would only allow games to be played on the system if they had this chip. This essentially allowed Nintendo to ensure that nothing but officially approved games could be played on the system. Of course, like any anti-piracy methods though, people still found ways around it. Anyway, looking back at R.O.B, while it was important for the initial success of the system, it didn't take long for people to realize that using a slow robot to awkwardly play games wasn't actually all that fun. The games themselves don't seem like they were received all that well, and R.O.B was pretty quietly discontinued after their console picked up enough steam to stand on its own. Alright, finally, now we have enough of an understanding of the history of R.O.B himself. Let's actually take a look at Stack Up since this is the Nintendo Challenge after all. While R.O.B in the US came packaged with Gyromite, the second game in the R.O.B series, the first game released in Japan was Stack Up, so that's what I played first. For these games, I used a second camera so that we could see R.O.B at all times. I had never seen R.O.B growing up, so I had to get this guy off of eBay, and he wasn't cheap. Each of these games come with their own set of attachments too, and since Stack Up didn't come with R.O.B in the US, it can be pretty hard to find Stack Up pieces out in the wild. Since the parts were simple enough, I figured it was fine to use 3D printed versions of the parts since that was way cheaper than the alternative. Unfortunately, it turns out the quality of the parts do matter here, as R.O.B often had trouble carrying a full stack of the blocks without them toppling over. It didn't make the game unplayable or anything, but just know that any problems I had with the blocks themselves were likely because I wasn't using the original parts. Now, I did run into some troubles with R.O.B himself. I think my Rob had seen some wear, because his torso was often a bit loose, which made it a bit hard for him to stay centered. This didn't cause too many problems, but because of this, you'll occasionally see me slightly adjusting Rob with my hands just to make sure his torso is aligned correctly. The biggest problem I ran into was that Rob occasionally would completely fail to read the flashes on the screen properly. In particular, telling Rob to move down would occasionally cause him to close his arms for some reason. I'm not totally sure what caused this, but I think it came down to the combination of the lighting on the TV and the lighting in my room. Because of this, you'll notice that I adjusted the lighting in my room a few times throughout the session. Apparently this was a known issue with bright TVs, as they made an adhesive that you could put over Rob's eyes to make his vision darker, but unfortunately I didn't have this. Alright, so what's this game even about? Right when you boot up the game, you are presented with the wrong title screen. What the heck is Robot Block? Apparently, this is the Japanese name of the game, and they didn't even bother to change the ROM at all when they brought it to the West, despite changing the title of the game. After this, you're given a few options. You have a test mode, which you can use to verify your ROB is working, a direct mode, a memory mode, and a bingo mode. I started with the direct mode. This mode was super simple. In the top right, you can see your objective. Here, it wants us to move the entire stack from the third position to the second. To do this, you must move a scientist named Professor Hector onto some buttons that command Rob to perform various actions. Basically, each time you hit one of these buttons, the screen flashes in a way that Rob reads in with sensors in his eyes that tell him what to do. As far as I can tell, the flashes all look the same to me, so I'm not even really sure what it is about each of these commands that make him move. Having constant screen flashing like this is a little rough, but it's pretty cool to watch Rob in the real world react to the game like this. With each level you progress through, you start in whatever state you left off, making the levels get a bit more complicated as you go. The maneuvers are randomly generated each time you play, and there's not any sort of ending, so I arbitrarily decided to go for 10 phases. Something kind of funny about this one is that the game has no idea what the state of the blocks actually are. The game just works on the honor system, and trusts you to press start when you have the right configuration. That's right, you could also just clear all these levels just by mashing the start button, which I even did later on to see what happens when you reach max points. Spoiler alert, it does absolutely nothing. My first phase went terribly. At first, I couldn't even get Rob to move at all. I eventually decided to just reboot him, and after watching him recalibrate, I was finally able to get him to move. However, I immediately had the problems with moving his arms downward that I mentioned before. After much struggle though, I was able to reposition him in a way that worked. Now it's finally time to actually move this stack. I moved his arms all the way down and had him firmly grasp the stack. You have to move him up at this point to give him enough space to move to the side, and while it was a bit scary, he lifted the stack up properly. Now for the moment of truth. Time to move the stack to the side. This did not go well, and the entire stack tumbled over while he was carrying it. When you mess up like this, the manual says you should restart, but since this is most likely an issue with my parts, I just stacked everything back up neatly in his arms and kept going. I only really had this problem when moving the full stack, so thankfully as I started to break the stack up, I didn't have this issue nearly as often. All I had left was to lower his arms and release the blocks. Finally, I beat the first phase. Man, that was so scuffed. After that disaster, somehow phase 2 went by without a hitch. I moved 4 blocks over to the side and beat the level with ease. Phase 3 was a bit more complicated, and I unfortunately ran into more problems with the downward movement. I pushed through though and cleared another phase. If you haven't figured it out yet, this mode isn't exactly all that interesting. You're just telling Rob to move his arms around to place a bunch of blocks in different places. There's a bit of novelty to it, but he moves so slowly, and there's no real challenge here beyond getting Rob to behave properly. However, something exciting happened in Phase 6, although it was once again an issue with Rob himself. For some reason, he randomly decided it was time to recalibrate and knocked over some blocks in the process. He did it again in the level later too. Man, this thing really has a mind of its own. In Phase 7, I actually made a dumb mistake. When moving from side to side, you need to make sure Rob's arms are high enough or else you'll bonk into other blocks in the stack. And here I didn't move up enough and crashed into the green block. Since it was my fault this time, I probably should have reset here, but I just moved Rob's arms up and put the green block back into place. I must have been getting impatient or something, because I made the same mistake later on in the level too. In Phase 9, I wanted to see if Rob could drop a block into place from up high, but this didn't end well and the block bounced off onto the floor. The 3D printed parts are pretty light though, so maybe this would have worked better with the original pieces. I did try dropping it from a bit lower, and that actually worked. Woohoo, I saved one entire input with this new tactic. In Phase 10, after a brief hiccup where Rob once again disobeyed me, the rest of the level went by without a hitch and I completed the direct mode. Next up was the memory mode, and this one was a bit more interesting. In this mode, you are once again given a state you need to move the stack into, but this time Rob doesn't immediately respond to the inputs you give him. Instead, you have to program the entire sequence at once, and then watch him execute your commands one by one. While this still may not seem all that interesting at first, the later levels require some pretty long sequences of inputs, meaning you had to carefully consider the state of the blocks at every point during your sequence. In a way, it actually reminded me of real programming, where you must write a list of commands and carefully consider the state of the program as you do so. I also don't know if I'm just being wowed by the technology here, but there's something cool about seeing the robot execute all your commands and move the blocks as you intended it to. My first phase of this actually went pretty well. I even managed to move an entire stack of 5 to a spot on the side without them toppling over. Of course, this was still with some assistance, just to make sure everything was stable. You could also adjust the speed of the inputs in this mode, and on the second phase I cranked it up to the max. This turned out to be a big mistake, because the moment he tried to lift the entire stack up, the entire thing toppled over. My inputs were still correct though, so I just put the stack where it was supposed to be at the end. Maybe I should slow it down just a tad bit. While this mode is definitely more interesting than the first mode, R.O.B misreading inputs was a much bigger issue here, as messing up at any point in the sequence causes it all to fall apart. Occasionally, after a misinput, I even forced him a couple of times to stay on track, which probably wasn't a good idea. That's probably how he got loose like this in the first place. It also caused him to recalibrate once, which ruined everything. One time, I got lucky in phase 6, where his down input did mess up, but it was so close enough to the end that he was just able to drop the stack from a bit higher, and I still beat the level correctly. While I am showing off a lot of the problems I had, there were definitely times where he worked just fine. All 4 of the last levels went pretty smoothly, so I definitely got a pretty good feel for how this mode was intended to work. After I beat phase 10, it was time to move on to the final mode, Bingo. This mode is totally different. While you're still shown an objective for each level, the colors don't matter anymore. You just need to match the pattern. However, now they've made the inputs much more difficult. You must hop around a grid, and every time you create a line of pressed tiles, it matches that to an input on the sides. This isn't easy to do though, as there are a few enemies on the board too. Hitting these enemies will knock Hector out and reset him onto the side, but more importantly, there is a pink spring guy that can hit tiles himself. On my first attempt, the spring guy forced R.O.B to input to the left, which knocked the whole stack over. Come on. It ended up taking some time, but I finally got the blocks in the right state and I beat a level in this mode. Since this one took so much longer to beat, I decided to just call it quits after beating it at least once, as beating 10 phases was pretty arbitrary to begin with. There's also a 2-player mode that I barely touched here. In this mode, player 2 plays as Professor Vector. He kinda just looks like a slightly younger version of Hector. Maybe he's Hector's son or something? Anyway, in this mode, you're trying to compete for blocks in a time limit. I think the intention of this mode is that each of you pick a side of R.O.B and you're each trying to get more blocks onto your side before the time runs out. I didn't actually play this one with another person, but frankly, it seems like it would end in a disaster. With how difficult it is to actually move the blocks, I'm not sure how this one doesn't just end with all the blocks toppling over and nobody being able to gain a lead. Anyway, with that, I checked out all the modes and my time with Stack Up was complete. On to the review. Well, this one was definitely an interesting one to say the least. While I did face a lot of technical issues with R.O.B himself, it's hard to say what was an issue with the technology and what was an issue with the fact that I'm using a worn-out R.O.B that was almost 40 years old. Of course, the 3D printed parts didn't help either, so I generally decided to excuse the technical issues when considering my score for this game. While there is a novelty factor to this one, it definitely feels more like a tech demo than an actual game. The direct mode in particular was pretty dull, although I ultimately did have some fun with the memory mode. It was pretty cool to see R.O.B respond to the game in real life, but he also moved so mind-numbingly slow that it really slowed the pace of the game down. This one was honestly pretty hard to score. I surprisingly didn't hate it, especially in the memory mode, but it barely feels like a game and I doubt I could play this one for long before getting completely bored with it. In the end, I decided to give the game a 5 out of 10. The tech is cool, but it's not too surprising that the game itself never really took off. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more of these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss out on the next one. Also leave a like if you enjoyed it, since it will help the channel grow and motivate me to continue this series. I hope I will see you in the next step of my quest to beat every Nintendo game.